Hey, deserving listeners, this is Chapter 8 in our deep dive on the psychology of Josh Powell. Humberto isn't here today because when I looked at my notes, it's basically me just yammering, and I didn't want to bore him. So I thought I would just complete the rest of the chapters, because I think maybe there'll be 2 more chapters without him, so that I just don't have to ask him to come over to my house and sit in the chair over there and just watch me yammer. Okay, so to recap where we're at, we're in early 2010, just after Josh killed Susan in December 2009, the previous month. And the disappearance of Susan becomes a huge news story. And there's just tons of circumstantial evidence right from the beginning, and it just builds and builds throughout December and then into January of 2010. Josh's story doesn't make any sense. He's saying that he went camping at midnight in a blizzard with his 2 sons aged 4 and 1. And coincidentally, that's the night that Susan disappeared. And Josh the whole time has her wallet and her purse and her cell phone and everything else that she owns. And also randomly, Josh decided to use the rug doctor to clean the couch thoroughly before he left for camping. Also, Susan wrote a secret note saying that if she dies and it looks like an accident, then it's not an accident. And she puts that note in a safe deposit box and explicitly states that Josh cannot have access to it. And there's dozens of other details, all indicating that Josh killed Susan, seemingly. But there's no body, there's no obvious motive. You have the life insurance, but it's not necessarily a slam dunk. And most murder cases, if you actually talk to prosecutors and investigators, they will tell you that usually you don't have to look very far to find extremely strong evidence of guilt. So the fact that we're looking at this and seeing just an obvious case, especially 2020 after Josh kills his children, it's harder when you're actually on the ground level. But the police are still looking into it. They're convinced that Josh killed Stephen pretty early on, if not immediately. And from the looks of it, it looks like, because the police are blamed a lot for not having done enough. From what I can tell in all of the sources that I looked into, the police, I think, may have done a lot. But I can't really tell, because the only way we have of knowing what the police did is to talk to the police. So take that for what it's worth. But the prosecutor, who is apparently in charge of charging someone like Josh, was saying that they can't charge him yet because they don't have enough information. They don't have enough evidence. The primary police officer investigating the case of Susan Powell, he has said repeatedly to the press that the prosecutor kept pushing back, even though he kept begging the prosecutor to charge Josh, because if they don't charge him, then Josh is free to, live in the world and thus clean up all of the evidence, which it looks like he did. And what the main police officer said was that there needed to be 12 months with a missing persons case, meaning that because there's no body, then it's considered a missing persons case. And you need 12 months before you can even begin to charge. That just sounds, I don't know, but that sounds ridiculous. And my best guess, based on almost no information, is that the prosecutor's office was way too paranoid about falsely charging somebody, even though they can't really get sued for such a thing. There's a lot of immunity, so to speak, that the prosecutors have, so that they have the freedom to make tough decisions like that. So I don't really understand why the prosecutor was so resistant to that. And The prosecutor has never come forward to the press, whereas the police have been in interviews talking about their story. So I don't know, but maybe the prosecutor knows that they screwed up. But they continue to screw up even though, because immediately the press and the public and the family were telling the police and the prosecutor to please do something. And so it just seems like one of those cases where the prosecutor, I mean, often in these highly publicized cases, the prosecutors want to grandstand, right? And be the hero. So I don't know. It's just, and maybe there's a legal reason, a viable, but I can't see it. So was the prosecutor just too paranoid about being accused of being too flippant about charging someone? Or maybe the prosecutor's wife ran off with some other man, and since Susan might have run off with another man, the prosecutor's like, no, it's just another case of another woman leaving. Yeah, just grasping at straws. So in the days after Susan's disappearance in the month, Josh is seen doing things seemingly to cover up the evidence. He's deep cleaning the house, even though by all accounts he was one of the laziest people on the planet, especially when it came to chores like that. He is seen, and there's all sorts of evidence of him driving all over the region, including renting a car and driving 800 miles. But the police don't really follow him closely. And there's a lot of details to this, and I won't bore you with all those details, but the police either couldn't get access to follow him closely, or they seemingly dropped the ball. I don't know. So Josh, at this point, probably thinks that he's going to get away with Susan's murder, but he is not going to get the insurance money, which many would speculate, including myself, that was a major reason why he killed Susan in the first place. But body was never found. There can be no proof of death because Susan might have run off. Then the life insurance doesn't pay up, right? So either Josh wasn't killing Susan for the life insurance money, or as I laid out in my long description of my theory of what exactly happened the night of Susan's disappearance, I think that Josh panicked for some reason. Either he screwed something up, or there was a new a development, a wrench in the gears of a system, or something happened that made him improvise his plan. Because it would make sense, given everything that was leading up to Susan's disappearance, that he was really intending on getting that life insurance money. So at this point, he's thinking, maybe I'm going to get away with this. The whole world basically thinks he did it, and he knows this because people are telling him so. But he's not going to get the insurance money, and Susan's income is now no longer available. So he's going to have to pay his own bills, and he's obsessed with money in a way that is problematic. Would force Susan to keep receipts and justify the smallest of purchases. He made the family live off of some gross, very cheap food like Top Ramen every night for dinner, even though he was also willing to pay $100 per month for a life insurance policy on Susan. Anyway, so Josh and the boys move from Utah to Washington State, to Puyallup near Seattle, to live with Stephen again. And people at the time were appalled that Josh was leaving town because Susan is still missing. You'd think you'd want to stay around. And it was just more evidence to everyone that Josh was guilty. And I don't know why Josh decided to move. He was very cheap, very frugal. So maybe he just didn't want to pay rent anymore, or didn't want to pay the mortgage anymore. I don't know. Maybe he wanted to be near someone that at least kind of supported him, because Stephen would support him and stick up for him in public anyway. And I'm guessing Josh didn't have anyone else like that in his life. So that's a possible reason. So the news story continues to grow and grow as more details start to come out. There's a lot to pour over, as you can tell by this deep dive. And Stephen and Josh, I think, both struggled emotionally with this public scrutiny and public criticizing. Josh and Stephen started to talk to the press, even though most people would tell Josh and Stephen, including Michael, the other, Josh's brother, Michael, who was close to Josh. Michael seemed like the only smart one aside from Jennifer, but Michael seemed like another smart person, and he would tell his dad and his older brother, stop talking to the press. You're not helping no one is believing you anyway, and you're not good representatives of your case. Josh is Josh and Stephen is Stephen. Y'all just gotta shut up and let it blow over. Yet Josh and Stephen just keep talking to the press. Stephen particularly seems to like talking to the press, I think because of his narcissism. So let's watch a clip of Stephen talking to the press.
The answer, it would be Josh's vindication, that we would move on. They had Susan, they maybe had Stephen Kosher, whom we think she's with.
So this is Stephen, by the way, Josh's father, and he just mentioned Stephen Kosher, who I talked about in the last chapter, because they believed, and some others did too, other internet sleuths thought that, and I think the police looked into it briefly, there was another person that disappeared from the same small town around the same time. I think it was a week later after Susan disappeared, or a month later, maybe a week. And there were mysterious circumstances around this Stephen Kosher disappearing, but there was no evidence that Susan and Stephen Kosher were connected. And even if they were, there was no evidence that they were having an affair, or it was just nothing that pointed in that direction. But you hear Susan Powell dropping that in to try to convince everybody that Josh is innocent.
I still believe that's a possibility. But we thought that would be the end of it. We thought they had them down there and they were just going down to pick them up. Maybe they had to get an extradition or order of some kind. And
so what he's talking about there, I believe, is a Mexico extradition. I don't know the country exactly, but they thought, and I think the police legitimately looked into it just to uncover all possibilities, that they might have fled the country. And so Stephen's talking about thinking that there was going to be an extradition and that everyone would be found
from Nevada. And then Friday morning they'd have a big announcement for us and we'd all move on and live happily ever after. It just didn't happen. We're really disappointed.
So your belief is she's alive, she's with someone?
Yeah, we believe that.
So when Stephen says he's really disappointed, he's not saying, I'm really disappointed that Susan wasn't found. No. What he's saying is, I'm really disappointed that the police didn't do their job by finding Susan and Stephen Kosher and that's what he's saying.
We believe she's alive. We believe she left with somebody. We're not sure if she's still with that somebody, but I don't know. She probably is.
So they keep saying this, and there's no evidence. they never give any evidence of Susan running away or who she might have run away from or where she went. There's just no indication of that. So for the rest of 2010, a lot happens, but I'm just going to highlight some of the most important details. So the family moved to Washington State, and Charlie and Braden are now in Puyallup near Seattle, and Charlie is going to a new school. He is, I don't know if he's in kindergarten or if he's in preschool. He would have been 4, maybe 5 by this point. And at school, he is observed by the teachers and the administrators as having a lot of behavioral problems. For example, Charlie told a group of kids that the Mormons killed his brother and his mom, which is interesting. Charlie also told a little boy at school that he was going to come to the boy's house at night and kill him because he hated Mormons. Charlie saying, "I hate Mormons. I'm going to come to your house and kill you." Charlie also said that he hated Jews, and he also said that he hated Christians. So all of this sounds a lot like Stephen and Josh. Both of them, maybe particularly Stephen, said all these things and much, much more. And you just got to figure that Charlie was getting it from them, either by just listening to them, overhearing them talking, or by Stephen and Josh brainwashing the kids, because there's evidence of both. And there's a secret recording of the household, Susan Powell's household, within which Josh, Charlie, and Braden lived, but also two of Josh's siblings, Alina and John, also lived there. And there's a recording, and on this recording are a lot of things, but one of the things is that you hear Stephen and Josh saying all number of things along these lines. And you can also hear little Charlie and little Braden are in the room as well. So we have proof that they didn't edit themselves around the boys. So, of course, you have to wonder what Charlie and Braden were going through, having suddenly lost their mother. And at least for Charlie, the thought is out there that she might be dead and that maybe his own father killed her. I don't know how much Charlie knew, but you just got to figure Charlie and Braden were going through a lot. And also, Charlie and Braden had behavioral problems in all likelihood because of Josh's extremely bad parenting, which I've already been over. So because of these behaviors, the school would often call Child Protective Services, CPS, or DSHS, and that makes sense. But I also think that since everyone assumed that Josh killed Susan, I think there was a lot of vigilantism happening, for better or for worse. I, of course, can't know that, but I imagine that, just imagine you're a teacher or an administrator in the school, and in the middle of this case, all of a sudden, the two boys are in your care, or at least one of them, and you start witnessing some weird stuff. You might even pay closer attention to what he's saying. And there were other reports like that too. The teachers or the administrators would overhear Charlie saying something that seemed to indicate maybe that's a hint as to where Susan's body is or something. There's a lot of that going on. And also you got to wonder if Charlie noticed that happening and that was kind of messing it up. I don't know. But the government, DSHS, Child Protective Services, they investigate because of the reports, and also, I'm guessing, because of the hypervigilance about this case. And DSHS, they visited the house a number of times, and these visits are documented. And among those documents, they mention observations about John, who is Josh's younger brother, another one of Stephen's children living with him. And they write in the document that John, this man, he was probably in his late 20s at this point, he was witnessed by the DSHS worker as walking around the house nude. On another occasion, he was walking around the house in a diaper. Now, I'm not going to yuck anyone's yum. I don't think anybody should, but let me go on. In his room, John had a hangman's noose just hanging there, and he had a giant poster of a woman with a sword in her genitals protruding out of her stomach. So, it's hard to imagine that, but I don't need it. I don't need to imagine it. I was trying to figure out the geometry of that, but anyway. So they document this as it's relevant because the boys are living in this house and they're wondering, are these boys, Charlie and Braden, safe in this house, right? And then you see this and the implications about John. Anyway, this raises a question about, are there more crimes in this family? Are there more fantastical angles to the story that we just never found out? I mean, what's the chance that we know all of the bizarre things in this family? It's possible that there's a whole other chapter that we'll never find out regarding John. I don't know. And also, John was abused severely by Stephen and exposed to pornography early in his life. So, sky's the limit in terms of what's going on with him. The other thing is this raises a major question as to why the family didn't take that stuff down or tell John to put on clothes when the government arrives at the house. Were they surprise visits? Or is it just bad judgment? Or did John resist? The family like, hey, put on some clothes or at least take off the diaper. And John said no. I don't know. But honestly, this is consistent with other aspects of the case. There's just so many bad choices made by these individuals, which I'll get into some more in a bit around Stephen. So the third thing about this case is, why didn't the government take Charlie and Braden out of the house at that point? All these reports, all the CPS reports, John walking around in a diaper with a sword poster, da-da-da. Well, the fact is that there's a very high threshold for a child to be taken away from their parents by the government, which makes sense, right? And believe me, I've seen way, way worse cases than this. Now, this eventually becomes a horrific case, but at this point, they don't have any evidence. They don't have enough evidence to take the kids away from Josh, unfortunately. All right, so that brings us to the end of 2010, and let's take a break. All right, we're back from the break. So that brings us up to 2011. A lot happens this year, but one of the notable things worth mentioning is that Josh agrees to sit down with ABC News and have a long-form interview. Let's watch a clip.
Searching these abandoned mines in the Nevada desert for clues, while Josh and his father, Susan Powell, have been making parts of Susan's old journals public, claiming it provides possible reasons for her disappearance.
What did those journals tell you about Susan's life growing up?
Susan was very emotionally abused.
Right, so I forgot to mention that one of the elements of their narrative, trying to vindicate, trying to make Josh look innocent, is by claiming that Susan's parents were abusive. And I didn't see any direct reporting on this, I think because even if there were indications in the journal indicating that Susan was abused by her parents, that the press didn't want to entertain this idea because they didn't want to support Josh's and Stephen's claim. But also, when it comes to Susan's disappearance and then the journals get read by the press and by the police, we should use discretion around what we publish, right? So I don't know what was in the journals regarding this, but I would be surprised given the way that Susan was with Josh. I mean, she was young, but I've already been over some of the things that we know about her behavior and her mindset. It's possible that she was abused, but we don't know. Anyway, so Josh, that's what he's referring to here. And he and Stephen will claim up until this point and during this interview that they have all this data from the journals indicating this.
As a child, her mother has she has a very angry personality. Her father is very manipulative.
Josh Powell claims that at times Susan was unstable, had even contemplated suicide at different points in her life.
She has...
Again, that could be true. You look at the journal of anyone, and there's a pretty good chance that something along those lines is going to be talked about. At the very least, emotional turmoil and angry feelings and hurt feelings. A lot of people will use their journal along those lines. And from their account, they're saying that she had threatened suicide. Who knows? There wasn't anything like that in the recent years, according to reporting. So I'm guessing it was when she was a teenager, but I don't know.
She has walked out the front door in her underwear, started walking down the street. And at the time when all this stuff was happening, it was mortifying to me. I tried to protect her from doing things that I thought might embarrass her or our family.
So in this sense, and I didn't hear any other reporting around this, but he, in this interview, is claiming that while married to Josh, she ran out the front door in her underwear, and then he's saying he tried to cover that up or protect her or something. And it's notable the way he words this. Let's review it again.
At the time when all this stuff was happening, it was mortifying to me. I tried to protect her from doing things that I thought might embarrass her or our family.
So now, would someone be embarrassed if their spouse ran out into the street in their underwear? Yeah, depending on the situation, I suppose. But you would also think that the husband would primarily be concerned about the well-being of his wife. How is she doing? How is she feeling? Why is she doing this? Also, you would think, if you're Josh, that you would highlight that. You would say she was very troubled and I worried a lot about her and I didn't want to talk about it and I don't really even like mentioning it here, whatever. But this is consistent. Although in this interview, he presents much better than other interviews, I think, because I'm guessing, and it would be normal for anyone in his shoes, even if they were innocent, to practice, to prepare.
In that respect, you know.
Josh says he thinks Susan may still be alive and wonders if she left him and their 2 young children for another man, a claim police will not substantiate.
Has she ever been unfaithful to you?
Never that I know of.
Then why do you think that she would just run off with another man?
She's a very sexual person.
Josh Powell's father.
So it's kind of interesting that when asked directly, he says, no, I don't know if she ever had an affair. There's no evidence that she ever had an affair. Because given everything else that he has said and done, you would think that he would say something like, yeah, she did have an affair, maybe more than one, and I don't want to talk about it. Or I do believe she had an affair because of this, this, and this. He just says no. So either this is evidence that he has a convoluted and confusing approach to making him look innocent, or he's smart enough to know that he has to only accuse her of things that he has some evidence of, or he wants to look like he's not entirely biased against her so he can gain credibility. I don't know, but it's notable.
That I know of.
Then why do you think that she would just run off with another man?
She's a very sexual person.
And then that statement is also interesting because that was something that was said by both of them a number of times. She's a very sexual person. Well, that means that she had an affair? And what are you basing that on? I think what he's basing it on is that she wanted to have sex with Josh because one of the main reasons was because she wanted to have more kids. I've already been over that. But I also think that she had sexual needs, and I think that she remembered the way that they used to be in the beginning of their relationship, Josh and Susan, and she wanted to get back there sometimes. And it's not unusual to think, well, if we can rekindle our physical intimacy, maybe we'll return back to that lovey times. So there's that. But
Josh Powell's father, Stephen Powell, then goes on to make the bizarre claim that he's had a sexual relationship with his daughter-in-law.
so in this interview, because I've seen all the footage and the interviews with the interviewer, the woman that's interviewing him has also been interviewed. And what she would say is that during this interview with Josh, Stephen is there just as a support person. And Stephen keeps interrupting. And then at some point, Stephen says, hey, he takes over. And then, the interviewer's like, okay, Stephen, how about you just sit down and let's talk to you. And then he sits down. He's not prepared. He doesn't have a reason to be there. There's really nothing. I don't think anyone at this point thinks that Stephen is involved in the murder. I imagine most people at this point anyway think that Stephen is just being a supportive dad the way that people will be. So watch what happens.
Susan was very, very sexual with me. She was very flirtatious. I mean, I'm her father-in-law.
We know the truth because we've been over all that data, and I've seen a lot more even, and maybe you have as well, that she was not sexual with him. He was criminally, disgustingly, disturbingly sexual with her, which we've already been over. So he's twisting that all around. And he thinks, so for people with narcissistic personality disorder, and I can't diagnose him, but he has some signs. They want to be in the spotlight. They can't stand it if other people are in the spotlight when they have things to say. And I think that he might have a competition, a narcissistic competition with his own son. That I think was a partial reason for him, Stephen, being infatuated with Josh's wife, because Stephen was like, how can you get a nice girl like that? I'll have that. That's mine, that kind of. Ugh. And also he believed, when you have narcissistic personality disorder, you're shut off. You shut yourself off from the outside world largely, because when you're very young, you had to do that in order to survive psychologically and emotionally. And so you don't allow input, which means that you have a hard time interpreting how other people would react. When I was watching the baby reindeer stuff and then the Fiona stuff, and of course I have no idea about anything, but if the story in baby reindeer is somewhat accurate, and if Fiona is indeed the real Martha, then we are seeing perhaps another example of that, where somebody, due to necessary adaptations as a young child, developed a defensive structure that involved what we would call narcissism, but as a part of that, they have to cut themselves off from other people and depend on the self. And they also have to pump themselves up because they're alone and they're scared and they feel worthless. And so they just have to invent that they're okay, but they have to go overboard because there's all these question marks. Am I okay? And the way to defend against that is to say, I'm not only okay, I'm superior. And everything I think is superior and everything I am is superior. Plus, children are all, to some extent, narcissistic. We want them to be self-centered so that they can develop and take care of themselves. So when you're a child, it's normal. But because of the environment that these children go through who develop narcissistic personality disorder, they never grow up. They're stuck in that mindset of the entire universe revolves around me. And so they don't know how to act in the world in a way that even serves what they want. Stephen doesn't want to be attacked by society. He doesn't want to be targeted by the police, which is about to happen. He wants to get attention. He wants to be seen. He wants to be seen as special. And this brief moment, and for these people, they are on a constant treadmill. Even if the previous day they were showered with accolades, the very next day it starts over again because they're on a constant treadmill running away from something that's on their back. The monkey on their back is the abyss of inferiority and nothingness that has always been with them. And they're just running. They think they're getting away from it, but they're not. And so for him, he's sitting in the wings, and the narcissistic supply isn't coming in that very moment. It might have been coming earlier, but it's not coming now. His rival is sitting right there, and there's a camera and all the lights, and I could do better than Josh, and he frankly could, because Josh isn't great in these situations. So Stephen is like, I'm better, and who knows, maybe even, I wouldn't be surprised if there were people who actually would write him or DM him or talk to him and say that they support him. When the news story is being watched by millions and millions and millions of people, even if it's 0.1%, maybe he thinks, hey, I got to get out to my fans or whatever. And then he pushes Josh aside, sits down. I got something to say. And then the first thing out of his mouth, he thinks, so consciously, I think what he thinks he's doing is that he is bolstering Josh's statement that Susan is a overly sexual person and therefore ran away with someone else, which is just such a stretch. It's like Josh just makes this random statement. She was a very sexual person. What? Where's your evidence for that? And even if she was, so what? Even if she was having an affair, so what? It doesn't mean that she ran away with someone, given all the evidence that points that you killed her and disposed of the body. But Stephen wants consciously to support his son. So he's like, well, I got a point here. I have a data point about Susan that supports what Josh is saying. Let me tell you, Susan was sexual with me. In fact, so watch this.
Sexual relationship with his daughter-in-law.
Susan was very, very sexual with me. She was very flirtatious. I mean, I'm her father-in-law, and she would do a lot of things that
I just love the interviewer's face. What's her name? I can't figure out what her name is, but I'm guessing y'all know. Anyway, let's continue watching.
She would do a lot of things that I mean, she did.
I mean, just think, and they've interviewed her, and she talks about her internal reaction because she, probably for a couple weeks, she's been preparing for this exclusive interview with the Joshua Powell. So she's getting all her ducks in a row, the questions, making sure her outfit is good and everything's going well. She got a good night's sleep, and she sits down and talking to Josh, and it was probably a little frustrating because the way Josh talks, it's so it just doesn't have a lot of substance to it. It's hard to grab onto anything, but she's getting stuff done, and then Steven's like interrupting, which is probably annoying her at first, and then she's like, okay, fine, sit. And then he drops this bomb, bombshell, as they say, that's not hyperbole, that Stephen and Susan had a sexual relationship. She's just, what is happening?
I did. I mean, we interacted in a lot of sexual ways because Susan enjoys doing that.
Do you think a part of you started falling in love with Susan?
That's pretty likely, yeah. I mean, I would say so. And
so these are excerpts from a much longer interview. You can watch the whole interview on YouTube, I believe. But at this point, what is Stephen doing? What is the goal? Because at this point, she's now going, okay, well, let's lean into this ball of wax. And there's questions, and then she asks eventually, do you think that you loved her? And he says, yeah, I think that I did. No one in their right mind would even admit this, given the landscape. And then two, eventually he just starts being honest, which is very, very interesting, I think. And I think it points to the narcissism, that he's not a psychopath primarily, who knows he's breaking the rules and just doesn't care about the rules. He knows that he's harming people and he just doesn't care. I think he is like a little boy who is looking for mommy, because I'm assuming that Stephen went through some real terrible shit when he was young. And he likes the opportunity to talk about this relationship with Susan. And I'll go over later. I'm going to devote an entire section to talking about Stephen's diagnosis, so I'll save it for there. But anyway, let's continue watching.
And there's no question in my mind that the feelings were mutual.
Despite his father's claims, Josh is still holding on to hope.
And then he says, I'm feeling that it's mutual, which he words it the way that he did before. He's very consistent in his private journal videos and written journal, in his statements to Susan, and in his public statement. There's no difference. He doesn't hide anything. He just states it. He just is like, yep, this is. In other arenas, like at work and other places, he is operating and functioning normally. Why would he be so impaired cognitively and in terms of his reasoning and his judgment in this arena? And I think it has to do with how I've already kind of described it and how I'll get to it later.
I think she's still alive.
At times. It's a roller coaster.
What would you want to say to her if she's watching?
That I miss her. That I love her. That she's got 2 boys who love her.
So after this interview, Josh and Stephen keep talking to the press. I'm assuming that Michael, Josh's brother, is continuing to tell them to stop talking to the press. Josh and Stephen are leaning into that narrative that essentially that Susan is a slut and therefore she ran away with somebody, and that they're being falsely accused by an incompetent police department. Now, the police are investigating this whole time. They're watching the news too, and they hear what Stephen and Josh are saying, and they hear Josh and Stephen pointing at these journals that are in their house saying, we have all this evidence. The police are watching this and they're thinking, this is our chance. We can get our hands on those journals because they are claiming that there's enough evidence in there to point in the direction as to where Susan is. And so therefore it justifies a raid on the house and a warrant for that information. I don't know exactly how the law works in this situation, but because Josh wasn't charged, Josh has certain rights regarding his property, and Susan's journals are his property now. So even if the police wanted it, they wouldn't necessarily have the justification to get it because the prosecutor in Utah is refusing to play ball. So I think because they are saying we have information that would point in the direction as to where Susan is, they get the courts to agree. And I don't know if this was a Washington thing instead of a Utah thing, and maybe the prosecutor in Washington was willing to play ball. Anyway, the police get a warrant and they raid the house, and they take everything, or lots of things. They take Susan's journals, of course. There's a lot of it. And they also take computers, and they look into file cabinets, and they just take boxes and boxes of stuff. And they also did so when they knew that Stephen wouldn't be at the home. There's a whole detail of that. Anyway, so at this point, the police are raiding the house, hoping to get the journals because they're wondering if there's something in there that would point to Josh as the killer. They're also hoping that they might be able to find something in there, something that Josh brought into the house from Utah that would point at Josh having killed Susan, or would point as to the whereabouts of Susan. Maybe it's a little tool that has some blood on it or something, or a computer that has an email about a that's what they're looking for. But instead, they find this pile, this mountain of evidence of the crimes of Stephen Powell. And let's watch a clip from that raid. So this is a video on the YouTube channel called Crime Con, and it's presented by Oxygen.
There was pornography found laid out on Stephen Powell's bed. And most shockingly was this cache of images of Susan Powell, but not just Susan Powell, but all kinds of women.
So just think about that. This is a house with 2 young boys. Charlie and Braden are maybe 6 and 3 at this point, and Stephen isn't home. And on his bed is just not only just all this pornography, but there's all these pictures of Susan and all these other women. Some of the pictures are regular pictures. You can see just regular types of pictures you would take at an event. But then there are other pictures where it's clear that the subject was not aware that they were being photographed. Really just disgusting.
So Stephen Powell had been going out in public and filming women, taping women without their consent, without their knowledge. And he had this obvious obsession with Susan and other women as well. But as you can see, even from this image here that's blacked out, he was taking videos and images of Susan without her knowledge while she's changing, while she's using the bathroom.
So just imagine that you're the police observing this, because of course we know that this was going on. I talked about this, and maybe you knew this from the news stories. They didn't know this. All they thought was that Stephen was a supportive dad. That's all that they knew. And then they hear on this interview and in other press interviews that Stephen and Susan had this affair, or what was going on there? Because without any counter evidence, you wouldn't know if Stephen's account was wrong or how wrong was it. Stephen says they had this very sexual relationship. Now, we know that it wasn't sexual except for him. He was, we've already been over that, but just imagine how that must have blown your mind. It's like, what am I seeing?
The most troublesome part for me is there's suggestion that Josh Powell knew this was going on. Josh knew his father was doing this and simply allowed it to go forward. So not only was Josh abusing his wife emotionally, physically, financially, but so was his father, and
So I've been over that evidence as to the question as to whether or not Josh knew that Stephen was doing this, and I'm not clear on that. There's a number of ways of looking at this. One, that Josh did know or had seen enough signs. I mean, Josh clearly was around when Stephen would, they'd be hanging around the house, Josh and Susan and Stephen would be filming a home movie and would really be focusing on Susan, maybe in times when she is wearing shorts around the house or whatever. And then the look on Josh's face, it just, I don't know. It's hard to read people's minds, but it kind of looks like Josh knows, oh, here's dad. So Josh comes over to Susan and sits next to her, that kind of thing. It's hard to know, but it's not a stretch. So there's that possibility. Another possibility is that, an analogous situation is you have a father who was sexually abusing his own kids in the house, minors, little, a 10-year-old child. And the perpetrator's wife sees a lot of signs, especially if it's ongoing. The spouse might and probably will see a lot of signs. They might even walk in on it sometimes. The emotional turmoil that goes through a spouse's mind, even for those that eventually go to the cops, it's not like they see something, they immediately call CPS, right? It's a very difficult situation, right? I mean, I could lay out all the reasons why it would be difficult, but I feel like I don't have to do that. And for some of these spouses of perpetrators, they will have been through a lot of abuse, maybe sexual abuse when they were growing up. They might even be sexually abused by the perpetrator themselves. And therefore, they bump up against a lot of trauma and trauma reactivity, maybe dissociation or denial or justification, or it's normalized, or fear or whatever. A lot of barriers to even acknowledging what's happening in your mind. And it's very, very common that the spouse of a perpetrator of sexual abuse of a child, the spouse won't do anything. Now, there are extreme cases where the spouse will do things actively to support the abuse, which makes it look like the spouse is also interested in abusing the child, which does happen, unfortunately. And if you were abused by one of your parents while the other parent didn't do anything, then you know how enraging that is. For some victims, they will be more angry at the non-abusive parent because that person didn't do anything. It's one thing to look at a perpetrator and be like, well, you're a perpetrator, you're a monster, you're going to be a monster. But what about you? You're not a monster. You had a choice and you didn't do anything. You knew what was happening. It's very upsetting, obviously, but it happens. So was Josh in that situation? Josh was being indoctrinated into Stephen's Hall of Mirrors. I don't know what to call it, his horror show Hall of Mirrors since day one. And Josh was the main victim, the primary victim of Stephen for Josh's entire childhood. Physical abuse, you could argue sexual abuse, verbal abuse, no doubt. So for Josh, he's not that old now, and he's been through no therapy. He's been through, he and Susan did a brief bout of couple therapy that I didn't go into. A little bit on that. They blew out of therapy very quickly. I don't know. I don't know exactly what happened, but the way it looked was that Josh was not participating meaningfully. Anyway, so Josh hasn't recovered. So, maybe Josh was in that situation. Or we just hate Josh and want to believe that he knew and approved of it. But take it from me, after reviewing all the data that I've seen, it's just hard to know what was going through Josh's mind. And I said all this not to say, hey, let's be nice to Josh. No, I'm just saying that, that's just how I see it. And we have enough reason to very much have negative feelings towards Josh, independent of trying to drum up things. You know what I'm saying?
Was allowing it to happen. So they find all these images, but they also find all these tapes. And if you can read, I know it's small script, it says, Susan Powell washing face, brushing teeth. Susan on stool, pantyhose.
Yeah, someone in the audience was like, yeah, right. So we know all this stuff. Maybe not the specifics, but in an earlier chapter, we reviewed all this stuff because I wanted to lay out the story chronologically. But this is when they find this stuff. So this is, a year and a half after Susan has disappeared. They're going into the house just to get the journals and maybe find something else about Susan's whereabouts. And then they come across this whole other category of crimes, not only on Susan, but all these other women, including children, which he'll get to, I think.
This is Stephen Powell filming Susan without her knowledge. And as Ann said, he was I guess we'll call him a singer if we're going to call him that. He made his own music and he would write songs about Susan. And
his name was Steve Chanson, I think. He had an album.
An alias. So he does all this, but I think the most shocking piece is what you're seeing in this image. These are all of Susan's undergarments that were found in Stephen's home.
Yeah, I think I forgot about this detail. That years out, so the last time that he would have had access to her underwear was when they lived with Stephen, which was all the way back in 2001, 2002. So this is 9 years later, and in the house, they find all of this stuff, which I believe is used items. You can see underwear, you can see clothes, you can see what looks to be tampon applicators. It looks like there are cotton swabs and other kinds of things. And he would use these to masturbate, according to his own journal, which they will discover upon reviewing all these tapes that they have confiscated.
These are used tampons, other hygiene products that Stephen Powell had collected over the years. And all of this is found during this investigation. And at the time, this is August 25th, 2011. At the time, Charlie and Braden are living in that home with their father. Also living in that home is Alina Powell and Josh's brother, John Powell. So on that date, they don't take the boys out of the home because they don't actually know what all is discovered.
So the police raid the house, they take all this stuff, and they take so much stuff that it takes them a while to sift through all of it and catalog all of it. They also took, I think, almost 20 computers from the house. There are a lot of file cabinets. I've seen a picture of, there's a closet with just wall-to-wall file cabinets, which I think was filled with all this stuff that Stephen had been doing. And once they cataloged everything, they counted 4,500 photos and videos of Susan. 4,500 photos and videos. And they discover that Stephen had been taking pictures and video of young girls in the neighborhood, aged 8 and 10. Stephen had been photographing them while they were naked in the bath and while they used the toilet. I don't know how he got access to that. I couldn't find any information on that. It makes sense they wouldn't want to go into detail in the press regarding that, but that's what's been reported. And they testified, the children testified, that they didn't know that they were being filmed or photographed. Not that that matters, but it just provides some context. So I think the issue here is that there are different levels of crime, right? Like if you steal a pack of bubble gum, that's a lower crime than stealing a car. And when it comes to these kinds of crimes, there are also levels to it. I don't know the exact levels, but I think if you are taking secret naked pictures of children and you have other pictures of naked children on your computer, I think that's a pretty high crime. But when it comes to voyeuristic crimes where you are filming your daughter-in-law in your house, I think those are lower on the list. I'm not entirely sure, because the way that the police acted from this point, and of course, they would want to protect the children, and they reacted quite strongly. And they charged him with charges of voyeurism and child pornography. And I've already been over voyeuristic disorder, I believe, in chapter 1. So at this point, the news story explodes through the stratus. It was already a big story. Now, it's just a fantastical story. It's just fantastical, this whole story. And people are now starting to think, whoa, Stephen, maybe he killed Susan, or he worked with Josh to kill Susan, or whatever. So tangent time. I think you could argue that this was perhaps the golden age of true crime in 2011, because I started thinking about all the famous cases that a lot of y'all have asked me to cover and do deep dives on. Cases like Amanda Knox and Jodi Arias and Casey Anthony. It was all around this time. So I decided to make a list of all the elements that support the case that around this time was the golden age of true crime, which is a horrible age to live through, because there's horrific tragedies that are happening. So I think a lot of things conspired for this to be true. I mean, one, true crime has always been a fascination to humans. But around this time in 2011, you have the internet get to this place where social media and Twitter and Reddit and everywhere else, I'm old enough to remember that if you talked about using the internet a lot, you were a nerd. If you emailed a lot, oh, you're a nerd. And then at some point, there was a sea change, and it just seemed like everyone was using smartphones and computers. I mean, there was a time when I was younger when just having a computer meant you were a nerd. So consider that. But when it became just mainstream for people to not only use the internet, but also to participate in the online conversations, that's when the internet just exploded with the activity, and true crime got sucked up in that maelstrom. Nancy Grace was huge at the time. Dr. Phil was gigantic at the time. And it's hard to understand how big these figures were, because in today's fractured media landscape, you can have a huge figure in media today who wouldn't even crack the top 50 in terms of the ratings on TV from 10, 20 years ago, because everyone was watching TV all the time. I'm guessing that in 30, 40, 50 years, when people think back to the early 21st century, they will remember more of the true crime stories from this period of time, around the time of Susan Powell's disappearance, than other times. Because listen to this list. You have Amanda Knox from 2007. You have the Virginia Tech shooting. You have Jodi Arias, Casey Anthony. You have the Jennifer Hudson family murders, 2008. You have the Batman movie shooting in Aurora, Colorado, 2012. You have Trayvon Martin. You have the Sandy Hook shooting. You have the Boston Marathon bombing. And that was a big internet-involved thing. A lot of internet sleuths who I think there's a lot of bad internet sleuthing that happened, like horrible, where they would target an innocent person as perpetrating the bombing, and then they would be, anyway. You had Oscar Pistorius, you had the Slender Man killings, 2014. You had some very famous and notorious police shootings in 2014. Eric Garner wasn't, I don't know if he was shot, but he was killed by the police. Tamir Rice, Michael Brown, and of course you have Elliot Rodger around this time. So I don't know, but it just seems like some of the biggest stories that I've ever heard about in my life, and they're all like in this period of time. And so the Susan Powell, Josh Powell, Stephen Powell, when Stephen Powell is discovered with all this, it just shot the story through the roof, which, because when I put the poll on Patreon asking people to vote on, just to suggest things and vote on what the next deep dive would be on, I was actually really surprised that Josh Powell won because the list was like 40 different things. And I thought, oh, Josh Powell, that's interesting. That was a long time ago. But, the story is so detailed. There's so many things. And when this Stephen Powell stuff came forward, it just, the internet didn't know what to do. And I understand. I have been obsessed with this case for the past 2 months. I spend almost all my free time like consuming. It's just, there's so many just bizarre details. And I've just been trying to wrap my head around the whole thing. And I'll tell you that it's been difficult emotionally, but a part of my efforts, I think, are kind of working in that once I get to a full conceptualization, which eventually I did, there is some comfort in it that I'll talk about in a later chapter. All right. So at this point, the government takes custody of the kids as well. They charge Stephen and they take custody of the kids because the kids were in the house with Stephen, and Josh was allowing the kids, because you would just hope that since it was all out there in the open, or at least some of it was out there in the open, that Josh wouldn't let the kids anywhere near the father, Stephen, right? And that was the implication anyway. So they take the kids, and let's take a break. But the rest of this episode is just going to be for patrons of the podcast. I'm going to talk about the custody issue, which is interesting. And then I am going to talk about my personal connection to this case. I'm not directly involved, but I'm lightly involved. And I'm going to talk about all that. I'm going to talk about the detailed assessment that was done by my friend on Josh himself. I have the psychological report in front of me. I can read the evaluation and the diagnosis of Josh. And then in the patron zone, it'll probably get into the murder-suicide, I think. I don't know. We'll see how much I have time for. But anyway, if you want to hear the rest of this episode, become a patron of the podcast. Otherwise, please take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.